There's no question that the key to happiness lies in the mind, and evidence of that is everywhere you look. People are constantly thinking that if I would just get this, or if I would just get that, or just if this would happen, or if that would happen, I would be so happy. And you really only have to think back to all the thousands of times in your life that you got exactly what you wanted, and yet you're still not happy. And it's a fascinating thing. People forget it, and they think, well, okay, I got that, but now I've got to get this, and they keep this cycle going all the time. Also, it's really, I think, in some ways obvious but important to discuss that people believe that certain conditions are going to necessarily bring about happiness. A quote, better job, unquote, more money, more prestige, more fame, more recognition, certain relationship or whatever. And yet people get these things all the time and they're still not happy. If achieving a certain level of status or driving a certain car was really going to make you happy, then of course everyone who drove that kind of car, there'd be a mad rush to that car because everybody who drove it would be very, very happy. And yet you see people dream of that expensive luxury car or that sporty new car, and they get the car, and a couple of days later they're complaining about the payments, or they're wishing the car were even better. I know a fellow who bought a beautiful home not too far from where I live, and really great guy, and bought the house, and the day he closed escrow, he really wished that he had bought the one next door because it had a pool and his didn't. We all do this all the time. We think that certain things are going to bring us happiness, but they don't. The only way to access a consistently happy feeling in your life is to understand that it's really up to you. It's your attitude. Happiness exists always in the absence of negativity. So your natural state is one of happiness. And if not for all your insecure, negative, self-defeating thoughts that you take seriously, what would be left is a nice, secure, happy, peaceful feeling. And I think just remembering this, or just reminding yourself of this simple fact, is extremely helpful in your quest to be a happier person. I've learned that there are quite a few principles of happiness to be aware of that are very helpful to be aware of if you want to be a happier person. And 5 in particular I've written about at considerable length, and I just want to briefly touch upon them here. And I'm hoping that as you listen to these, you will become curious to explore them further, because each one, of course, could be a whole session in and of themselves. The first principle of happiness that I'd like to talk about is the role of thought, or the role of thinking, in your own life and in your quest to be a happier person. Thinking is something that we're constantly doing, just like breathing. But until I mentioned the word breathing just now, I bet you weren't aware of the fact that you were doing it, were you? And thinking is very much the same way. You're always doing it, yet so seldom are we actually aware that we're doing it. So we're thinking things all day long, from the moment we wake up until the moment we go to sleep, and probably all night long. We're always thinking about things. And so much of what we think about is negative. We think about our problems and our concerns and our worries, and we're thinking about this and we're thinking about that, and who wronged us and what's going to happen next week and all these things. And it's incredibly important to remind yourself that you are the person doing the thinking. You are the source of those thoughts. So it's a little silly, don't you think, to have a thought like, gee, I'm not going anywhere in my life, and then wonder why you're feeling insecure. It just doesn't make any sense, because you're the one who's having those insecure thoughts. This simple recognition is extremely helpful in your life because it empowers you. It reminds you that you're the one who's in charge of your own happiness. So simply remembering that you are the thinker is extremely helpful. We tend to take our thinking very seriously. We think about something, then we get all bothered by our own thoughts by it. And I think it's helpful to think of the subject of thinking in much the same way that you'd think of the subject of dreaming. Dreaming is nothing more than night thinking, and thinking is nothing more than day thinking. Now, if you had a dream, if you went to sleep and you had a dream that you brought your car in to get fixed at the mechanic, and you went to pick up your car, and there were more problems when you picked it up than when you dropped it off. When you woke up in the morning, you wouldn't run down to your mechanic and chew him out, would you? Of course not, because you'd recognize that it was just a bad dream. But yet most of us will engage in conversations in our own heads, in our own minds, like, boy, that person really wronged me, and boy, I'm sure mad about this. And see, we'll take these thoughts very seriously, and we'll blow them out of proportion, and we'll follow them day after day, month after month. We take them very seriously. We forget that, wait a minute, it's me doing the thinking. Once you recognize that it's you, you can drop it just as easily as you can drop the nighttime thoughts that are dreams. In my investigation of what's out there in the way of happiness training, stress reduction training, and the like, it's always fascinating to me how certain professionals in the stress field will have very specific techniques for dealing with nighttime thinking. They'll say, count to 10, or write down your thoughts in a journal, or go up and have a glass of milk, or there's thousands of little things that people can do, I suppose, that presumably will help. And when people ask me the question, well, what do you suggest when people are sleepless at night and they're swimming around in their thoughts and I can't go to sleep and all this? And it's always occurred to me that it's so obvious that your nighttime thinking is a reflection of your daytime thinking. It'll always be the case that when someone is troubled at night, they'll be troubled during the day. People who develop good mental hygiene, people who develop healthy thought processes, people who take the challenge seriously enough to really work on their daytime thinking will find that if they master that, or if they move in the direction of healthier thinking during the day, then lo and behold, at night, the troublesome thoughts will disappear. And it always seems to be the case, and I've heard over and over again that it really works. So people will, for example, be having these thought attacks in their head during the day, and they'll stop doing it so much, and they'll make improvements, and all of a sudden they'll be sleeping better. And a lot of times the reason people can't recognize this is that they're so distracted during the day. There's so many things going on, and they've got all these conversations going on around them as well as inside their own minds, that they don't even recognize how destructive their thinking is during the day. So they'll say to me, well, I don't really have negative thinking going on during the day. And I'll say, well, why don't you start paying attention to your thinking during the day? And lo and behold, they'll say, I just started paying attention and I realized that 90% of my thinking during the day is negative. And I say, well, why don't you try and catch yourself when you're having those kinds of negative thoughts? And they'll get better at it, and pretty soon they'll calm down, they'll become more serene, they'll become calmer, more peaceful, and then every night they'll go to bed and they won't be so consumed with the negativity. So again, to recap, the idea is to become more peaceful during the day, and that should transfer to a more peaceful night's rest. The next principle is the subject of moods, which of course we've talked about a little bit already. And essentially the principle of moods reminds us that we are like Jekyll and Hyde. We're like two different people. In high moods, we tend to be very charismatic and magnanimous and non-defensive and easygoing, and we can accept criticism and everything seems very hopeful. And in negative moods, we're very pessimistic and take ourselves very seriously, and we're very defensive and critical and annoyed, and everything bothers us, and we sweat the small stuff and we sweat everything else too. And we tend to think that life is going nowhere, and we're really, really in a bad space, and there's nothing good about our life. And we forget that our mood is the source of our experience, not the effect. In other words, most people think that, when you're down in the dumps, it must be my wife, or it must be my husband, or it must be my job, or my children, or my life. It's got to be something. You forget that in a higher mood, your entire life looks very different. I think one of the easiest ways to relate to this concept is that, when you're driving in your car and you look over at the passenger side mirror outside the door, there's a little sign on most of those mirrors that says, objects in mirror are closer than they appear. It's like a mirage. And you can extend that same metaphor to your life, and you can quite accurately say that life is never as bad as it seems when you're in a low mood. So this wisdom reminds you that when you're low, that's the time to remind yourself that, aha, here I am again. I'm not seeing things clearly. If I just wait it out, if I take it easy, if I calm down, clear my mind, my mood will lift. And as it does, the same situation will look drastically different. So I encourage you to play with this one a little bit, work with it. It's incredibly helpful in terms of creating more happiness in your life. Another principle that's really fun to talk about is separate psychological realities. And just very briefly, what this means is that all of us live in our own world. None of us see life identically. None of us see life in the same way, and it's absolutely predictable that people are going to see things differently. So when someone says to you, I can't believe you say things like that, or I can't believe you see it that way, instead of getting defensive and instead of being annoyed, you can say, well, of course they're going to think that. Of course my thinking is going to be very different than that person, and that's okay. If you think about the things that annoy you in your life, so often it's people saying things or doing things that you wouldn't do. And the whole essence of this principle of separate psychological realities is that, of course it's that way. That's just the way life is. And rather than having it surprise you when people are different, it should surprise you when they think the way you do. There's a lot of freedom in this thought. It reminds you that, yes, indeed, we are different, and that's okay. And this is not just merely a matter of saying, okay, I'm going to tolerate our differences. It's more a matter of saying to yourself, of course it's that way. It's always going to be that way, and it always has. Most wars have been fought because people don't understand this concept. Most marriages break up because people don't understand this concept. Most friendships get into trouble because people don't understand this concept. And I think if we can just remind ourselves that, okay, it's not important that we all see things identically. You hear all these songs on the radio about, oh, how sad it is that you can't see eye to eye with people and how it's really important that you see things the same way. It's not. My wife and I see a lot of things very differently, but we just understand that that's sort of the nature of life, and that's okay with us. And consequently, it brings a lot of joy and fun to our relationship rather than creating a big problem. Another principle of happiness that is so incredibly powerful and convenient is the principle of feelings. And basically what this says is that we have built into us, all of us, a built-in biofeedback system that tells us from moment to moment how we're doing psychologically. If you sprained your ankle, that's giving you, on a physical level, that's giving you a lot of information. It's reminding you that, hey, you know what? It's time to take some time off, to take the weight off of my legs. I can't go running or walking right now. I've got to give it a rest. Or if you have a really bad stomach ache, it tells you that, you know what? This is not the time to eat a big meal. This is really good information for me to have this stomach ache. Emotionally, it works exactly the same way. If you're feeling angry, depressed, upset, jealous, resentful, overwhelmed, stressed out, bothered, or whatever, or any other assortment of feelings, all that's really telling you is you've gotten off track, you've lost your way, it's time to clear your mind, it's time to try to get back to your center, and these kinds of things. Bring yourself back to the moment. What most people do, and I think that one of the biggest mistakes people make when they want to live a happy life, is they get angry and they start wondering why they're angry. They start thinking about it and talking about it and studying it and analyzing it and getting into what I call analysis paralysis. They really beat it to death. Or when they're feeling overwhelmed, they roll up their sleeves and they get to work and they work harder and they start scrambling rather than saying, you know what, I'm feeling really overwhelmed right now. I'm feeling off. This is telling me something. Aha, it's time to back off. It's time to take a break. It's time to take some deep breaths or whatever. So this concept of feelings is very powerful. You can think of it almost like the dashboard of your car. If the warning light starts flashing, it's telling you that something's wrong with your car. It's time to pull over, maybe stop the car. You don't start wondering what's wrong and keep driving and put your life at risk. You step back. And similarly with your feelings, if your feelings are negative in some way, it's just good information for you. It's good information. It's time to reevaluate, to think differently, to check in with your thinking and to see how you're doing. And if you're off track, that gives you an opportunity to bring yourself back to a more positive feeling. And finally, one of the principles that we've already discussed a few times, which is worth repeating here, is the principle of the present moment. And just to recap, the essence of that principle is that so often our minds are anticipating future problems or concerns or worries, or they're reviewing past events that are over and done with, and we're just keeping them alive in our thinking. And rarely are we right here. Most of the time, the present moment, this moment that we're in right now, is not so bad. You might be listening to a tape somewhere right now, or listening in your car, or whatever you're doing. And if you really evaluate how you're doing in this moment, you're just driving to work, or you're driving somewhere, or you're sitting by yourself somewhere. It's not that bad. But if you fill up your mind with all these problems that you're going to have to deal with later on today or tomorrow, that's where you get into trouble. And the trick is to just recognize when you're doing that and then remind yourself of what you're doing and bring yourself back to this moment, because usually this moment is fairly special. And if you start to appreciate this moment, you'll find that if you do the best you can in this moment, and then the next moment, and the next moment, and you keep repeating that process, that the combination of effective present moments is going to lead you to a very effective life. I want to bring up something at this point which is extremely important to me, and I want to make myself really clear on this one, because really what I do for a living is teach people to be happy. I've been kidded from all the books that I've written and the lectures that I give as being Dr. Happy Talk. I've been kidded by critics, by psychologists, psychiatrists, and everybody else for being too Pollyanna-ish. And I think I've made myself very clear in my various books, and I want to do so again here, that in absolutely no way am I a Pollyanna. I'm not unrealistic. I think it's a terrible idea to pretend you're happy, to put on a smiling face when something tragic has happened in your life. Nobody is happy all the time. I'm not happy all the time. You're not happy all the time. That's not the idea. The idea is to navigate ourselves in a direction and to constantly be making adjustments so that we can have the potential to put ourselves back on track toward a happier life. I was told by a pilot once, and I can't attest to the absolute accuracy of this, but I was told by a pilot that if you're flying from San Francisco to Hawaii, that rarely are you exactly on track. The wind is making slight shifts in the aircraft, and you or the computer is constantly making adjustments trying to get you back on track towards your ultimate goal of landing the plane safely in Hawaii. And I always think of life in the same way, that you're probably never going to be completely content at any given moment, but you're always moving in that direction so that you can catch yourself when you're going off track. I think it's really important here, because we're not trying to pretend we're happy. We're not trying to say that when something tragic happens in your life that you should say, oh goody, this is really great that I have to deal with an audit, or that somebody in my family died, isn't this wonderful, yippee. That's not what I'm talking about, and I just want everybody to know that. As you become a happier person, however, I have to tell you that even tragedies take on a different flavor. For example, when you are an overall happy person, when you have a great deal of contentment in your life and someone tragically dies that you love, there's even a different experience there. I've been told by numerous people that as they become a happier person and somebody dies, their feelings of grief quickly turn into feelings of gratitude for the person that they've lost. There's these deep, rich feelings of having been blessed to have that person in their life. A very unhappy person experiences that death quite differently. The death is seen as a tragedy, which of course it is in all cases, but there's a different quality. There's more of an inability to be able to get over it, and more of a holding on to the pain and not experiencing the gratitude that goes along with the pain. So I just think these are really important issues to address, because I really want to be clear about what it means to be happy and what it doesn't mean. The happiest person in the world is not always happy. He or she will have his or her share of unhappy moments. The difference is they'll be able to get on track faster than the rest of us. I've been asked the question, what have you seen as things that hold people back from being truly happy? And I'd have to say, in my experience as a lecturer and a writer and mostly as a human being, that my experience is that life is rarely exactly as we want it to be. It just is as it is. And the closer any of us come to accepting that and embracing that fact in our life, the happier we will be, because there'll be less of a dichotomy between what is and what we want. And it seems to me that the biggest obstacle to being happy is this insistence that most of us have that life be different than it is. So we're in a certain job and we're insisting that we're not going to be happy until that job changes. Or we have a difficult 2-year-old who's throwing a lot of temper tantrums, and we're not going to be happy, darn it, until that kid gets out of this stage. Or until we're getting better sleeps at night, or until this changes, or until we make more money, or until the Visa card gets paid off, or whatever. There's thousands of things that all of us insist we're different. But again, life isn't really designed to accommodate us, and life is not going to accommodate us with fewer demands or setting itself up in a way that's going to make our life easy. That rarely happens. Instead, life is just the way it is, and if you can accept that, if you can say to yourself, okay, this is my circumstance, this is my set of challenges, and I'm going to make the best of it. And I know this is the way life is, and I accept that. Life is this way right now. So when you're experiencing chaos in your life, that's what you're experiencing. If you try to embrace it and you stop resisting it so much with all your might, it gives you a sense of surrender and a sense of peace and equanimity that I just don't see very many people experience. So I encourage you to really take a look at your life and to stop resisting what is. Instead, try to embrace what is, and I think you'll find yourself a lot more content and happy. In my personal life, I know a number of people who I would consider to be truly happy. And in all cases, it feeds back into the same discussion that we just had a moment ago. That people who are happy, the people that I know who are truly happy, genuinely happy and content, really accept life the way it is. Now, when I say accept life, I don't mean you roll over and play dead and don't try to make changes and that you just sort of accept the fact that things aren't going to get better. That's not what I'm talking about at all. I'm talking about if you are married and you have a family and you have a certain number of responsibilities, that's what your life is. So you make the best of that life as it is, instead of wishing you had fewer responsibilities and wishing you had more money or wishing you had more freedom or wishing you had this or wishing you had that. So many of us make the mistake of insisting that we live in some sort of a dream world that doesn't in fact exist. It's important to embrace the life that you have. Every person that I know that's truly happy accepts where they are. They say, this is my set of circumstances, this is my life, and by golly, I'm going to make the best of it. And in all cases, they just create this beautiful life out of that recognition. So many people spend so much time wishing that they were different or their life was different that they miss the moments that they do have in their life, consequently making it a lot more stressful and difficult. I always think it's helpful to talk about the subject of acceptance because I remember when my good friend Robert was killed by a drunk driver, and I was able to spend some time, a very short amount of time unfortunately, but a little bit of time with a very special human being named Stephen Levine, who's worked a lot in the hospice movement and worked with a lot of people who were dying. He's with a lot of people on their deathbed. And he shared with me some wisdom that's always stuck with me, and that is that life is what it is. And each moment is very different, and some moments are very painful, but it still is what it is. And even something as tragic as death is what it is. And there's a way in which acceptance of the moments changing and acceptance that you can't hang on to life being a certain way, that the only consistency in life is change. And that's so true, that one day your spouse is being terrific and supportive and the next day they're being grouchy, and one day your kids are doing well and they're not fighting and the next day they're fighting like cats and dogs. And this idea of surrender or acceptance and being okay with the fact that things change and you put on a few pounds and you make that okay. That doesn't mean you don't want to take the weight off. It just means that, okay, it's all right. I'm okay. That's what it is right now, and so I'm going to accept that, and I'm going to make the most and the best of this moment and each moment that I have. Each moment is a gift, and each gift is different. My life after my friend died was quite different than it was before he died, but yet I learned to accept that and that life is different now. And I've noticed that in more mundane areas of life as well, where there's an old expression, when you're hot, and when you're not, you're not. Sometimes you just can't get it right. You sit down to work and you just don't have it. And other times you feel like you can do no wrong. And there's something so powerful and so beautiful about accepting that and realizing that that's just part of the rhythm of life, that sometimes you've got it and sometimes you don't. If you don't fight it, if you just allow that to be and you accept that and you embrace this idea of change and acceptance, the downs don't last very long. They just tend to go away. There's an old saying, this too shall pass, and it all does. You'll notice that. Things come on, challenges arise, people are difficult, you have a difficult challenge, something is imposed upon you, and if you step back and you look back on your life, you realize that you had lots of these challenges, and every single time you got through it. And proof of that is here you are. And yet we always think that this one's different, This is the tough one. I'm never going to get through this one. And yet you will. You'll get through it. I know you will. And I think back on all the difficult things I've confronted in my life, and it's very humbling to think how you got through them, and then also that you can get through this one as well. So this whole idea of acceptance is indeed such a critical factor in developing more contentment. It's essential that each of us take responsibility for ourselves and our own happiness. There's this belief that other people are supposed to do it for us. Our spouse is supposed to be so supportive that they make us happy. Our children are supposed to behave in a certain way or achieve certain things, and that's going to make us happy. Or someone has to do something to make us happy, and that's just, of course, utter nonsense. People can do all sorts of things for you, and if you don't have the right mindset, the right attitude, you're never going to be happy. And most people can relate to that because they've experienced a good number of instances in their life where that was the case. People do all sorts of things for us all the time, and yet if we're not happy, we're the ones that need to change. It's very important to be proactive, and being proactive is really another way of saying the same thing. It's that you need to take charge. You need to make changes in your life. It's not your spouse's responsibility or your children or your parents or your employer or your friends. It's no one else's responsibility to do it for you. You have to make the changes necessary to create the life that you want. There are so many people with desperately difficult-looking lives who I have met that are just shining, inspirational examples of the way people can be resilient and resourceful and happy and kind and generous. And these are people who live in very difficult conditions, poverty and housing projects and the like. And of course, there are many people who appear to have everything. They've got a great life and money and health and a great family and possessions and achievements and talent and all sorts of wonderful gifts. And yet they're empty and they feel dissatisfied and unhappy. And it's often those people who think that someone else ought to be stepping up to the plate to do something for them. And when you ask them, they're not quite sure what that would be. But they'll say, well, someone's got to do something for me. Someone's got to change. Someone's got to be different. And yet, again, it just doesn't work that way. If you want to be a happy person, you have to take responsibility. You can make it happen for yourself by making happy choices, by recognizing your own thinking. When you're going in directions in your thinking that are leading you places you don't want to go, you have the capacity to just say to yourself, whoops, there I go again. I'm doing it again. Oh, well, I'm human. I'm not going to go there this time. And you back off. And, this is something that doesn't come easy. It's very stubborn. Habits die hard, and thinking habits are the hardest of all to break. I probably, to this day, I'll catch myself 10, 20, maybe 30 times a day engaging in negative dialogue to myself. And people will say to me, I can't believe that you still do that after all these years. I mean, I teach happiness, but it's an ongoing process. It's not something that all of a sudden one day you're going to wake up and you're never going to have a negative thought. It just doesn't work that way. It's something that you have to do all the time. And it's fun, though. But what else are you going to do with your life? If you're here, you might as well make the best of it, turn it into an adventure and a growing process. And you can really win the game. It's a fascinating adventure. And when we talk about creating miracles and happiness, that's what we're talking about, is learning to detect when you're engaging in thinking that's going to detract from your own happiness and refusing to go there, refusing to engage in those kinds of conversations in your head. I call them, of course, thought attacks in my books. These insidious conversations that go on in the privacy of our own head, and they're designed in some way to convince us that life is really hard or it's more difficult than it really is. And they are so tough to break. We have all these little thought attacks, and we think that if we just think it through enough, somehow things are going to get better. And of course, they never do, and we just keep thinking, one more of these conversations, I'm going to justify my unhappiness, and I'm going to justify my right to be unhappy and all this kind of nonsense. And I've never seen anybody win this game, and I don't expect to. So if you want to be a happy person, it is indeed going to have to come from you. But the good news is you can do it. Another thing that's really important is that we don't create what I like to call as-if traps. And an as-if trap is very simply, we act as if certain conditions apply when in fact they don't. necessarily apply. For example, we act as if when someone criticizes us, we have to become defensive and fall apart. Or we act as if our spouse flirts with someone else, we have to become jealous. Or we act as if when a child is disrespectful, we have to get angry and fight back. We have thousands of these little cause and effect scenarios that we've created in our mind that don't really exist other than in our own minds. They're not like laws of nature. If someone criticizes you, you don't have to fall apart, but we assume that that's the appropriate thing to do. And so we go around and live our life, and we follow all these self-created, made-up rules that in effect have no place in our life. And if you can begin to see how many of these as-if traps you've created for yourself, it can be shocking, and it can be very eye-opening as well. Another tip on taking responsibility for yourself and your own happiness is to become inner-directed. This is something that I'm absolutely passionate about. Becoming inner-directed means listening to your own instincts, listening to your own wisdom, knowing what's right and what's wrong for you, not allowing other people's disapproval to dictate your actions, your decisions, your behavior. Certainly you can take them into consideration, but at the same time, really developing a sense of knowing of what's right for you. Had I listened to other people in my career, I would have ended up probably selling insurance or becoming a financial planner or something like that. My goal was always to help people, to write books. I wanted to write books when I used to flunk out of English in college, but I knew there was something that I wanted to do, and very glad that I followed my dream. And most people who are very happy in their careers will tell you similar stories. It's interesting. They'll say, everyone said I couldn't be an athlete, or I couldn't be a salesperson, or I couldn't be a chef, couldn't be a pilot, but yet I knew in my heart that's what I wanted to do. So that's what I mean when I'm talking about becoming inner-directed. It's really listening to yourself. It doesn't mean discounting everything that people have to offer. It just means really trusting yourself first, even if it means you may need to make some mistakes and stumble a little bit, but really trusting yourself. Along with that is the idea of loving yourself first. And of course, some people will confuse this and they'll say, oh, that's narcissistic or that's selfish. And it's really not at all. When I say love yourself first, it's a very important concept because there's a principle at work here, and it goes something like this. When you have what you want emotionally, when you love yourself first, when you have what you need in an emotional sense, the natural thing to do is to then reach out for others because you have what you need. You can only love other people to the extent to which you can love and accept yourself. So if you love yourself first and you have what you need and you feel satisfied within yourself, then you necessarily have what you need. You can then extend yourself to other people. You become more giving, more loving, more accepting, less judgmental, kinder, gentler, more generous, and all the rest. And it all stems from loving yourself first. And finally, I'd say that being spontaneous and flexible is another key component in taking responsibility for yourself and your happiness. The ability to take life in stride and not be locked into certain positions or certain ways of doing things. Life has a way of changing and plans get broken, and so many people are so upset when something happens that isn't to their liking. It's not part of the plan, and yet so often things do happen. If you can learn to take these changes in stride and learn to be more accepting of the changes in your plans and not be so rigid and tied to a certain outcome and tied to doing things the way it's always been done, what happens is you open yourself to the experience as it is instead of as you wish it were. I just recently was involved in a family reunion, and my sisters and their families and my parents and my wife and my kids and a whole bunch of people were all together. And it was a very interesting experience. It wasn't at all what I would have imagined it would be, but because I think the whole family did a good job at being open to it, we all had a good time. It was quite different than previous family reunions, but if you had an expectation, if any of us would have had an expectation that it had to be a certain way, we would all probably left early because it wasn't that way at all. But so often I see people struggling over the fact that, we don't do family dinners like that, or that's not the way we do Thanksgiving, and they're so upset and immobilized and bent out of shape over the fact that plans have changed or people have grown and they're doing things differently. It's really important to be flexible and spontaneous and be able to shift gears and change directions, and when you do, you'll find that you'll be a lot happier person. As I reflect on what's made me happy in my own personal life, it has become obvious to me that the biggest single factor is that I have realized that I am not my accomplishments. I used to rush around and collect achievements and things like that, and I've realized that life itself is enough for me. I mean, I just every day wake up and I'm just amazed at how neat it is to have this gift of life, and I really mean that sincerely. I mean, it's nice to accomplish things and to be successful and all that, but when you put a lot of emphasis on that, and I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't put some emphasis on it, I'm just saying when you put too much emphasis on what you do, I think it was Wayne Dyer who said this incredible quote that has always stuck with me. I just love it. He said, "When you are what you do, then when you don't, you aren't." And I just remember hearing that a long time ago, and it's just always been a gentle reminder to me that I'm not a writer or a speaker or a father. I am a person, a spiritual being who happens to write, or who happens to speak, or who happens to have beautiful children in my life. And I think disidentifying myself from my accomplishments and my achievements has probably been the single biggest factor in creating harmony, because when you focus on what you do, then there's an awful lot on the line. You know, you've got to always be improving yourself. You're never good enough, and if you let down your guard, someone else might replace you, and you're disappointed when your ranking goes down, or when your status goes down, or when you make a mistake. There's always someone to compare yourself to. But when you just see yourself as a human being rather than a human doing, it just makes life so peaceful, because there's so much less riding on every action. And then out of that happiness, out of that peace with who you are, you then go ahead and do things. You do the best you can. You write the best book, or you sell the best product, or whatever it is that you're doing for a living, or you spend the best time that you can with your children. But you don't do that first. You do those things and other things out of that nice feeling of peacefulness. If I were to leave you with one thought on happiness, I think it would be just a gentle reminder that there's no way to set up your life good enough or convenient enough to make you happy. There's no job that you can have that's going to be trouble-free. There's no spouse that you're going to have that's going to do it for you. There's no family life. There's just nothing. There's no way to set your life up in a way that you're guaranteed to have happiness. The only way to have happiness is to make those choices internally, those attitude choices, those behavior choices, those decisions on which thoughts to follow and which thoughts to disregard, in a way that's going to lead you towards happiness. So it's not your life, it's within yourself. It seems that so many people are interested in bringing a sense of spirituality into their work life, and it's really touching, and I'm just so happy to see that happening, that so many people are interested in that whole notion. But it's interesting because so many people will come up to me at a book signing or after a lecture or whatnot, and they'll say, Rich, I'd love to bring spirituality into my work life, but I really can't, because I'm really having to deal with difficult people, and I'm under constant deadlines and dealing with bureaucracy and a lot of hassles at work, and it's really difficult to be charitable and kind and all that under those conditions. It's probably easy for you because, you work for yourself and your life's a lot easier. And I always sort of chuckle at that, because it seems to me that that's the perfect opportunity to bring spirituality into your life. If you believe in things like charity and giving and kindness and patience, I mean, what better place to practice these qualities than at work? When you're dealing with a difficult person, do you blow it out of proportion and overreact and jump up and down and grit your teeth? Or can you practice patience and forgiveness and kindness and giving the person a break? Or if you run a company, or even if you work within a company, can you encourage the company to be more giving? Is there any way you can encourage corporate giving? Can you develop programs where you're giving back to the community, whether it's a certain percentage of your net profits, or whether it's a certain percentage of a certain project, or it's organizing a food drive, or whatever? There's just there's limitless things that people can do. And yet most people don't, because they think, well, I'll get to my spirituality later when I have more time. I'll get to it when I've got time to pray, or I'll get to it on Sunday, or when I get to it when I have time to meditate, or early in the morning or whatever. But the truth is, every moment is a new opportunity to practice spirituality. And when someone's short with you on the phone, that's a perfect opportunity. So I think the trick is to really ask yourself what attributes and characteristics are important with regard to your own sense of spirituality. If patience is one, then practice patience. If giving is one, then practice being more giving. Put your money where your mouth is. Try to bring a sense of your own unique charitable values and spiritual values into your workplace. And it's amazing what happens when you take the initiative in this area. I encourage this at almost every corporate event that I do, and invariably someone high up in the company will come up to me and say, you know what, there's more that we can be doing here too. Thanks for bringing it up. And I don't do a lot of follow-up, but I suspect that some action is taken. People love, by and large, to be giving. They love to be kind. They love to help people out, people who are less fortunate than us. And most people have it in their heart, but sometimes they just need a little nudge. And if you're setting a good example, it's astonishing how many people will jump on board. I've organized food drives in the past with almost 100% involvement from everybody I've asked. It's just amazing. When you start something, everyone wants to participate. And what's more, they will then, when you're finished with your project, they'll want to do their own. So I think it's really a mistake to wait to practice your spirituality. I think it's more appropriate to try and merge your spirituality into your work life and to make your work an expression of your own spirituality. There is certainly a belief, I believe it's a myth out there, I'm certain it's a myth, that many people seem to have, that if you become gentle, relaxed, happy, non-stressed, that you can't possibly be successful or become a superachiever. It just simply isn't true. It's funny, I think people are frightened that if they become relaxed and gentle, they are going to get walked on and be left behind, and they're going to lose their edge, and they're not going to be able to set limits. They're not going to be firm with people. They're not going to be achievement-oriented. And my experience, and not just with myself, I consider myself a successful person. I just don't see the need, and never have, of treating people poorly, of rushing around, of getting uptight. I always think of being uptight as if you could think of the last real big giant meal that you had. Maybe it was a family reunion, or last Thanksgiving or Christmas or Hanukkah, or at some holiday with your family, where you ate a really big giant meal, and if you remember how you felt afterwards, in almost all cases people will say, oh, I remember that. I felt tired and sluggish, and I ate too much, and I just wanted to curl up on the bed and go to sleep. I just had nothing left. And metaphorically, I think of the same thing when I think of being stressed out and tired and talking about it and uptight and boy, am I busy and all these kinds of things, that when you're really overly hyper and busy and bothered and stressed out, it takes an enormous amount of mental energy to maintain that kind of state. I think it takes away from your focus. It makes you tired. It interferes with your clarity, and I believe it's a major source of distraction from what you're really focused on. You're so preoccupied and consumed with what's bothering you and how busy you are that you can't oftentimes see what's right in front of you. You can't see the obvious. I've met so many interesting people these last couple of years on the road, chairmen of the board of companies and mothers of 5 and 6 children, and people who are just so good at what they do and so accomplished, and yet they just don't let life get to them that much. And I'll ask them, what's your secret? How come you're able to be that way? And they'll say, well, what's the point of being uptight? How does that help me? People run around thinking and defending their distress and their stress and saying, well, you'd be stressed out too if your life was like me. And I don't think so. I think I could say the same thing, that sometimes my schedule looks like something out of a science fiction movie. Sometimes my wife looks at it and she goes, oh, yuck. But I think there's a way that we can learn to have chaos around us without letting it affect what's going on inside of us. And when we do, it allows us to really see clearly what it is we're doing, what's important, what's critical, what's essential to our success, whether or not we're living in alignment with our own stated goals and objectives, whether we're seeing the big picture or whether we're focused on minutia, and all these kinds of things and more. So I think it's very important to come to the understanding that it's okay to be calm, and it's okay to not be stressed out and be telling everybody how tired you are all the time, and you can still be a champion at what you do and be really good at it and successful as well. I think most people start out in their careers with a lot of passion and living on purpose and having a dream of either doing what they're doing or at least having what they're doing lead to something greater or something better for themselves. And over time, the same mental habit that I keep referring back to over and over again creeps into their consciousness, and that is the tendency to focus on what you don't like in your career. And at first it seems kind of innocent, and it is to some degree, I suppose, but you focus on the demanding boss, or you focus on the bureaucracy, or you focus on the politics at work, or you focus on the elements of work that you find distasteful, that you don't like, and pretty soon you're talking about those things, and you're complaining about them to your spouse or your friends, and that becomes the focus of your attention. And unbeknownst to yourself, you're gently and slowly replacing the enthusiasm and passion that you have in your life and in your work with all of this distress. And your mind is preoccupied with all these things that bother you and all the things that you don't like about your work. I've spoken to many people in the last few years who will say things like, boy, I really hate my job. And I'll say, really, well, what is it you do for a living? And they'll say something like, well, I'm a secretary or an administrative assistant. And I'll say, well, how do you spend your day? And they'll say, well, I talk on the phone a lot. And I'll say, do you like talking on the phone? They'll say, oh, yeah, I like talking on the phone. And I'll say, what else do you do with your time? And they'll say, well, I type a lot. I'll say, do you like typing? Well, yeah, I like typing. And I'll say, do you like the other aspects of your work? They'll say, well, I like most of it. And I'll say, but just a minute ago you told me you hated your work. What is it you hate about your work? And they'll say something like, well, I don't like the politics, or I don't like the way the company is run. And they'll focus on one aspect of something within their career, and they'll blow it into this great big deal. They'll blow it up out of proportion, and they'll focus on it, and consequently they'll lose their passion. They'll focus on what they don't like about their work. So I think the trick is to really focus on the positive without, again, being a Pollyanna. I mean, you don't have to pretend that everything in your career and in your job is wonderful, but really instead just tend to focus on those parts that are. So if you want to get the passion back in your work and you want to be on purpose in your career, the best place to start is to stop complaining and to start eliminating those things in your mind that exist that you don't like. Now, that doesn't mean you pretend that you like everything about your job. No one likes everything about their job. I don't like everything about my job. I don't really like airplanes, quite frankly. But I'm in airplanes like sometimes my kids say to me, do you live on United Airlines? I mean, I'm always traveling on airplanes. I don't like airplanes, but I love my job. But I just figured that's part of what I do. I get on airplanes a lot. And everybody's got things about their jobs and their careers they don't like. So if you want to get that passion back, stop focusing on the things that you dislike or that you find distasteful, and you'll find yourself getting more enthusiastic and more enthused about your day-to-day experience. And over time, this can build back up into a very passionate experience about your career. When people do things that are inspiring, they tend to turn them into great things. When people are inspired, they make very creative decisions. They're willing to take chances. They're willing to step outside their comfort zone. They're willing to try new things. When you do something that doesn't inspire you, you tend to get very repetitive, and you tend to not take any risks, and you tend to do things the same way habitually over and over again. So the trick is inspiration, to find things that are inspiring to you, and when you find those things, you'll find it's easy to take it to the next level and take it to the next step and to turn that inspiration into an entire career, which is a very exciting thing to do. I found that there are 5 distinct steps that people can take advantage of in order to achieve their full potential at work. And I think they're worth discussing here. The first step is what might be called pacing. Everybody has an appropriate, ideal pace to work under. I found that sometimes we get so caught up in the frenzy of work that we work at a faster pace than we're normally accustomed to or that we are drawn to. So we get drawn into other people's pace and other people's frenzy and all the frantic behavior. Occasionally, and far less often, we get drawn into a slower pace than we are normally accustomed to. I like to think of what's called the stacking order, and the stacking order is an interesting concept that I like to talk about that has to do with how many projects you can handle at any one given time. You know, for me, for example, I like to work on 2 or 3 projects at a time. That's what's fun and nourishing and exciting for me. Other people will go crazy only working on 3 projects. They might want to work on 7 or 8 projects. Other people would go crazy working on 3 projects because they might want to work on only 1 project at a time. And they don't feel comfortable going on to the next thing until they're completely finished with what they're working on. Sometimes, of course, you have very little control over it. If you work for other people and they're throwing projects at you, you may not have a full decision-making capacity in that regard. You may have to work somewhat at the pace of other people, but it's still very important to at least be aware of your preferred pace so that you can factor that into how you handle each particular project. Work at a pace that is ideal, that nourishes you, that gives you space, that doesn't wear you down. You know, people say, oh, I've got so much to do, I've got to get it all done today. But, you know, if that gets you sick more often, if it makes you nervous, if it detracts from the quality of your work, you really have to ask yourself if it's really worth it. You know, so as a first step, I really suggest that people really take note of the pace that they're working at and really try to design a pace that really works well for you. The next step has to do with your relationships at work. And we've spoken about a few of these topics before, and I'd like to just touch on them again. The first has to do with rapport. It's so important in working relationships to develop rapport with people. And one of the consistent mistakes that I see people making is going forward without the necessary rapport. You show up at someone's doorstep or at their desk and you want something from them and you demand something of them, or you're too pushy and you haven't taken the time to develop that rapport, to make that connection, to ensure that the person's on your side, that they're listening to you, that they have time for you. So often we just jump in and we assume that the person's going to drop everything for us and they're going to give us their full attention. I'm always amazed when people will call me and they won't ask me if it's a good time. You know, they'll just pick up the phone and they'll start talking and totally oblivious to the fact that I might be in the middle of something. So one of the policies that I have is when I call people, I'll always ask them 100% of the time, is this a good time for you? You know, is it all right to talk about something right now? Or would later be more appropriate? Would later be a better time? And it's surprising because a lot of times people will say to me, no, this really isn't a good time, but thank you so much for asking. Can you call back later? Well, when I call back later and it is a good time, they remember that I gave them the courtesy of asking. And so our rapport is enhanced and the conversation invariably goes very smoothly and we end up working well together. It's so important to take that time to develop an appropriate and positive rapport with other people. Along the same lines, it is critical that we strive to enhance our presence with other people. And again, we talked about this earlier as presence being that ability to connect with people at the heart level, of really making that connection so that you're listening to each other, you're looking each other in the eye. You can detect presence or more specifically, you can detect a lack of presence even on the telephone. That's when your mind is wandering, you're thinking about something else, you're thinking about your next appointment, and there's almost nothing you could do to ensure poor communication than to have a lack of presence. So really take presence and the power of presence into consideration. When you're present with other people, it's very nourishing. They feel it. They become better listeners, your learning curve is enhanced, and overall your communication will be far better than it is when you don't have that sense of presence. it's very important when you're dealing with relationships at work to set appropriate boundaries with people. Some people know no boundaries. They don't know how to create boundaries, and they don't respect the boundaries of other people. Classic example of this is when people call you at home at dinner time, when your family's sitting down to dinner, and they'll call you because they know that's a good time to catch you at home. And if you're foolish enough to take the phone call, I suppose you take the bait, but the probably more appropriate way to handle that is to set appropriate boundaries that work for you. So if you don't like to be bothered at home, you make it very clear to people that you don't like to be bothered at home. You don't give out your home phone number, and if someone does happen to get it, you tell them it's only for use in emergencies. Now, some people don't mind at all being bothered at home. If you don't have children, or if it's just something you don't mind at all, for whatever reason, that's okay, and you may have to set different boundaries. People set boundaries at work for all sorts of reasons, everything from having the boundary of not dating people at work to not having close friendships at work for whatever reason. People set boundaries for a variety of reasons, and it's important to find out for yourself what things bother you and what times you would like to be left alone, and to let people know what it is you will and will not tolerate so that you can maintain your sanity and keep your perspective at work. I'm of the strong belief that it's very important for your sanity and for your family and for your personal growth and your sense of peace and equanimity in your life to set very firm yet flexible, I'll call it, boundaries at work, and in order to create a sense of balance in your life. People oftentimes work until all their work's done, and so they come home at midnight every single night and they still never get everything done. And I would ask people, why do you work 16 hours a day? And they'll say, well, I've got to get all my work done. And I'll say, well, does it ever work? Do you ever get all your work done? And they'll say, well, no, I don't get my work done. Then I say, well, why don't you work 23 hours a day? And they'll say, well, I can't work 23 hours a day. I'll say, why not? Say, well, you got to draw the line somewhere. So I'll say to them, well, if you're drawing the line at 23 hours, why are you drawing it at 16? I mean, couldn't you draw it at 9 or 10? You're still not going to get all your work done. And they'll say, that's not a fair statement. They'll say, you're trying to trick me. And I'll say, no, I'm not. I'm trying to demonstrate a point that it's all made up. The amount of hours that you work ultimately is up to you, all things considered. And you have to factor in, of course, the amount of money that you need to make and the type of job that you're in, obviously, and every job's a little bit different. But so many people assume that there's no way to set a balance or to create a life outside of work, when in fact there really is. I know for me, there are certain events with my children that I won't miss. And if there's an important soccer game to one of the kids or something at school, there is nothing that would make me miss those things. And people will say, well, that must be a very expensive decision. And I'll say, no, it's not. Because if you don't do something, something else always comes up. And I've always felt that way. I felt that way when I had my first job. I remember setting very specific hours and not being willing to work all night when my wife and I were first married. I wanted to spend time with her. And I just don't think you should put a price tag on your personal life. I'm not for sale. And I know other people who feel the same way. They'll say, you know what, my kids are only going to be little for a certain number of years, and then they're probably not going to want to be around me for a while anyways, so I'm going to take advantage of it now. And their critics could say, well, yeah, but you're not going to excel in your career as quickly, or you're not going to get everything done. And they'll say, well, actually, I don't think that's true, because I'm so happy with my life. I'm so satisfied. I have no resentment. I wake up in the morning, I'm enthusiastic about going to work. So I think this idea of creating a balance and recognizing that you have some choice in that balance. It's not all imposed upon you. Sure, maybe some of it is. But really starting to recognize that if you're working 16 hours a day, a great deal of that is your own decision. And you also can make the decision to change that decision and to work a different number of hours and to create more balance in your life. My guess is that if you create a happier environment for yourself and your family, and you develop more peace and happiness in your life, you're going to be a better employee or a better worker, whether you work for someone else or for yourself. Your life's going to be richer, and that's going to come across in all that you do. One of the reasons people have brought me in to speak to their organizations is that people are starting to realize that there's a real bottom line benefit to happier employees, even if it's just a little bit happier. There's a limit to what you can do in a 1-hour talk, obviously, but if people are inspired and they're laughing and they're not taking themselves so seriously and they lighten up a little bit, they're happier people, and they treat each other better, and there's less fights at work and less problems to deal with. So I'm happy to see that the world is waking up to the fact that there's actually a bottom line benefit to happier employees. We've spoken quite a few times on the subject of moods, and as a recap, I think it's really important to achieve your full potential at work. You have to pay very close attention to your own moods and to the moods of other people. When you are in a really low mood and you're feeling sorry for yourself, or you're really tired, or you're just not on that day, there's going to be a tendency to feel sorry for yourself, take yourself seriously, take criticism very personally, become a poor listener, overreact to things. But if you're aware of the power of moods, you can immunize yourself from the effect of the mood by recognizing its power and its presence. Similarly, when you understand the power of moods and the perceptions that change as a result of moods, you can learn to detect when the people you're working with are in a low mood. When someone's in a low mood and they're highly critical, and you understand that they're in a low mood, you will take their comments, their criticisms, and whatnot far less seriously. Therefore, you won't exacerbate the problem by becoming defensive and creating problems where there really was none. So often, the mood itself is the only problem there is. And if you're aware of that, you're certainly going to be one step ahead of most people who seem to be completely oblivious to the power of moods and therefore take most things very seriously, blow them out of proportion, turn them into a great big deal, and I guess in short you could say they sweat the small stuff at work. And finally, in order to achieve your full potential at work, it's very important to learn to deal effectively with difficult people. Most people seem to believe, at least when you talk to them about it, that they are the only people on planet Earth who have to deal with difficult people at work. And the sad truth is we all have to deal with difficult people. The question really, or the most important question I should say, is how we go about it. Can you learn to deal with difficult people with a sense of equanimity, with a sense of perspective, by seeing the innocence in their behavior, by seeing the effect that their mood is having on what they're saying and how they're behaving and what they're doing and how they're treating you? Or do you blow it out of proportion? Do you make a really big deal of it, and do you focus on it, and do you go home and talk about it with your friends and your spouse? The way that you deal with difficult people at work is going to affect you a lot, because it's going to rub off on the other parts of your work. You know, you're going to get a reputation as being a very difficult and defensive person if, when dealing with difficult people, you overreact and you talk behind their backs and you engage in backstabbing and you turn it into a great big deal. If, on the other hand, you can keep your sense of humor, not make a big deal out of it, you're really going to be in the driver's seat and you'll be able to minimize the effects of those difficult people at work. Another way to achieve your full potential at work has to do with the way that you deal with deadlines. This is a really critical issue. I told a story in my new book, Don't Sweat the Small Stuff at Work, about these two gentlemen who were in an office. I was in the waiting room waiting for the person whom I was to meet. And these two people were in the room next to me, and they were talking about this deadline, that was how unfair it was that they only had 2 hours to complete this project or this report that they were working on. And they talked about it for nearly an hour while I sat in the waiting room, and they were complaining about it and how unfair it was and how it always happens to them. And they went on and on and on and on and on. And I was out there taking notes again about how destructive this was. And I was sort of chuckling in my chair because I was realizing that they had a 2-hour deadline and they just wasted an entire hour talking about how unfair the deadline was. You know, deadlines are a fact of life. I'm sorry to say that authors are not an exception to this rule. I'm oftentimes under very tight deadlines. But what I've realized is that when you're on a tight deadline, that's what it is. And you can complain about it, and you can commiserate with others, and you can blow it out of proportion and make a great big deal out of it, or you can sit back and just get to work and get it over with and make the best of it. And as simplistic as that sounds, it truly is the most effective way to deal with the deadline because, again, the deadline is what it is. You still have to get the work done. It's up to you how you frame that within your own mind. We spoke about what I call the free-flowing mode of thinking. We also referred to this in some respects as the back burner of your thinking. You know, the difference between analytical thinking, where you're weighing your options and you're comparing your job to other people's and you're thinking it through and you're analyzing your past and you're analyzing your options and you're really putting your foot to the metal and you're thinking everything through and you're getting all uptight about it. That's the analytical mode of thinking, or the computer mode of thinking, as I sometimes call it. The other type of thinking, which is appropriate here, is the issue of free flow. If you quiet your mind down, if your desire is to change careers or have a more fulfilling career, and you feed that data or that information into your mind and you say to yourself, okay, I'd like to discover what options I have that are different than what I'm doing right now. What hidden talents or what changes could I make in my career that would enhance the quality of my life or the direction of my life or the direction of my career? What could I be doing differently? And it's shocking that if you ask yourself that question and then you just let go of it, you clear your mind and you allow yourself to think in this other way, it's amazing some of the answers that will come to you. I know in my own life as a speaker, I'll oftentimes be literally walking up to the podium to deliver a speech. My mind is clear. I've not prepared what I'm going to say. Just in the nick of time, right before I go on to speak, it becomes very clear to me, for this particular group, this is what I need to cover. A lot of writers will tell you that. A lot of cartoonists will tell you that. A lot of people who are in any form of creative job will tell you the same thing, that when they let go of it, when they don't think about it so much, or at least so actively, that's when they come up with their best ideas. And that's when you come up with your new ideas. When you're thinking analytically, you're oftentimes thinking habitually. You keep going over the same set of facts. You say, well, here's what I'm good at. Here's what I like. Here's what I don't like. Here's what I'd like to change. Here's what I'd like to keep the same. These are my options. And you start going over it and over it in the same way that you look for your keys when you lose your keys. You put them on your dresser and you look on your dresser and you don't see them there. So you go downstairs and you look on the kitchen table. They're not down there. So you go back up to your dresser and you look on the dresser again. The keys still aren't there. You go back downstairs. And we do this with our thinking. We just keep going over and over and over the same set of facts. However, when you quiet your mind and you think in this more passive way, that's when you give your mind the opportunity to present itself with new answers. One thought after another. It's almost like, those cafeteria trays you have when you're in a cafeteria. You pull one tray out, another one pops up. That's what free-flowing thinking is like. You have one thought, you dismiss it. Another thought comes up, it's new, you dismiss it. Pretty soon, new ideas are coming to you, and that's the essence of coming up with a fresh, new idea that can change the direction of your career. There certainly is a movement in our culture toward what might be called voluntary simplicity, and quite frankly, I'm part of that movement. I don't believe that more is better. I think that quality is always more important than quantity. I also think that when you look back on your life, it's very unlikely, if you have the privilege of looking back on your life, I should say, it's very unlikely that you're going to say, boy, I'm glad I collected all those things, and I'm glad that I saved that extra money, and I'm glad that I did this, and I'm glad that I did that. I think more likely you're going to look back and you're going to say, I wish that I would have pursued my dreams. I wish that I would have created a life that I truly loved. So if simplifying one's life is going to create a more peaceful life, then I think I'm all for it. I think that's what people ought to do. However, that being said, I think that a huge percentage of people tend to put the cart before the horse in this issue. In other words, people will have a very busy mind. They'll have a very busy life. They'll be addicted to all the stimulus. They'll be addicted to all the hype and the collecting of achievements and the collecting of rewards and the high salary and all this and that. Then they'll start going crazy. So they'll say, okay, what I need is a change in my life. So I'm going to move to the country. Well, I've seen this over and over again. People move to the country, but you take yourself with yourself. It's like there's that great book out there called Wherever You Go, There You Are by Jon Kabat-Zinn. I just love that book, and the title particularly, because he really speaks the truth there, that if you move out to the country and you have a busy mind, all you've done now is just created a longer commute for yourself. You really haven't solved the core issue. But when you put peace of mind first, when you put slowing down to the speed of life first and foremost in your mind, it's really remarkable what starts to happen, because as you slow down from the inside out, what you will find is that being all hyped up And achievement-oriented, exclusively achievement-oriented, loses its appeal. Again, I am not arguing against achievement. I love to achieve. I love to see my books doing well. I love to speak to large audiences who love what I hear. I'm all for achievement. What I'm talking about is neurotic achievement, a neurotic need to achieve at all costs, and that's all there is in life, and there's no balance and no fun and no family and no enjoyment. That's where I think we need to draw the line. But again, as you slow down from the inside out, as life becomes less of an emergency to you, as it looks calmer and more peaceful, then you look at your life and all of a sudden it doesn't look the same. You'll say, you know what? I'm on too many boards. I'm doing too many things. I need to slow my life down. I need to cut back my schedule. I need to change jobs. I need to do this. I need to do that. It becomes very obvious to you. So what I'm saying is simplifying your life might very well be a really great idea. But more important than that is learning to slow down from the inside, because when you do, you will know precisely what actions you need to take in order to slow down and simplify your life. I'm always amazed and touched by people who have what I would on the surface look at as a boring job, who absolutely turn it around and make the best of it. It's just unbelievable to me. Like someone who's taking money at the tolls, for example. I've seen people who are singing to the customers or to the people driving through the toll gates. And I ask them, I'll stop them and ask them, what is it about you that is so inspiring? Why are you so happy? They'll say, I don't look at my job as taking money from people to cross the bridge. I look at it as my job to see how many people I can make smile in a given day. And I have contests with my friend Fred over there, and we see each day who can make more people smile. And we keep an honest tab of that tally, and each night we talk about how many people smiled. I think that's a powerful lesson for all of us, whatever we do, that to create miracles in your career is not that difficult. Miracles are everywhere you look. You know, you can make the best of anything. I mean, I have talked to IRS people who are thrilled with what they do. They're not out to get people. They pay their taxes too. I've talked to people at the DMV, the Department of Motor Vehicles, who are truly inspiring, who look at it as their job to help people solve bureaucratic problems and hassles. And they do. And they'll tell me, you know what, I feel like I'll get recognized someday for this. And even if I don't, I know that I've made the very best of my career. And they'll tell me that things like, when someone's frustrated and they're caught in some bureaucratic hassle and I'm able to help them find a solution, it inspires me. It brightens my day. I get to go home and tell my spouse about it. And it makes me feel good about my career. It's a miracle that someone could really be happy at the DMV waiting in line. And I look at all the people in my line smiling, and I look at all the people in the other lines frowning, and I feel good about myself. And so, to me, it's utter nonsense when someone says, well, my career is different, you know, I can't make the best of this. This is a really boring job. To me, that's just nonsense. I mean, there's good and bad in every career, and it's up to each of us to find our own miracles, to look for the best and to look for what's good about what we do. And the thing about human beings is that when we look for something, we're usually able to find it. So I really encourage you to take an honest look at your job or your career and find out something new and special that you were taking for granted before, something that you love about your job. Focus on what's right about it, and you'll find that you will open your eyes to new things. You'll find out, you know what, I'm a really good communicator. I wonder if there's something in there for me. I wonder if there's other talents that I have. Or I'm a really good writer, or I'm really creative at writing advertisements, or I'm really creative at talking to people, or I'm really good with people, or I'm a really good mediator, or I'm a really good problem solver, or whatever. You know, the more optimistic and open you are to strengths in your career, the more things you'll start to see that you're good at, that inspire you. And that's going to always open the door to new adventures in your career and to help you make miracles in everyday life.